What is up everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we are checking out USA and India versus China and Russia. Who would win? This is a military army comparison. So I know you guys love this sort of content, so I have another one here for you. Don't forget guys, if you enjoy this sort of stuff, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's get straight onto the video, see what we got.
This episode is brought to you by Skillshare. The first 1,000 people to sign up using the link in the description will get their first 2 months free. The US is for global war. But what if China and Russia decided to set aside their differences and join against an Indian-American alliance? Who would win, and how would that war play out? The rules of this war game are, as usual, no use of nuclear weapons allowed, and no other allies can be called upon. First, let's take a look at each contestant's military might and see what capabilities each would bring to the table. First up is India, the world's 4th most powerful military, with an active duty force of 1.4.
Okay, so these 4 countries are all pretty strong. Like, imagine if they team up, like USA and India, they are big countries, and China and Russia. Imagine just those 2 countries fight each other. Like, that would be some crazy stuff. So this is going to be a crazy video.
Million and a reservist force of 2.8 million, India can call upon a deep pool of manpower to prosecute any war. India also possesses a formidable air force with 590 fighter aircraft, 804 attack aircraft, and a huge fleet of surveillance and transport helicopters that numbers at 720. India, however, suffers from a lack of attack helicopters with only 15 in its inventory. This may prove to be a
Okay, I think USA can cover the attack helicopters for that one.
Crippling deficiency in any attempt to combat a Chinese-Russian incursion over its mountainous northern and eastern borders. India does, however, maintain a force of 4,400 combat tanks, of which about half are modern or semi-modern T-90s and the indigenous Arjun main battle tank. India is also equipped with a staggering number of towed artillery, 4,100 pieces, meant to make it impossible for their Chinese rivals to penetrate Indian defenses across the mountain gaps of its northeastern border. Its naval forces include 1 aircraft carrier, 14 frigates, 11 destroyers, 22 corvettes, and 16 submarines, a sizable collection of naval hardware that its immediate threat, China, would be hard-pressed to defeat. Next up,
okay, the numbers there were not bad. It's quite impressive, to be honest.
Is China. China is the most populous nation on Earth and maintains an active duty force of 2.2 million with a reservist force of 510,000. With an air force totaling 1,125 fighter aircraft, 1,527 attack aircraft, and 281 attack helicopters, China has a serious advantage.
Yeah, they have a lot more attack helicopters
in the air over India. Yet China's pilots are undertrained compared to their Western counterparts and forced to fly under strict supervision from ground controllers, a huge liability in fast-paced modern air combat. China also has a force of 7,700 tanks and 6,246 towed artillery, backed up by 2,000 self-propelled artillery, mostly ballistic missile launchers, which would pose a significant threat to Indian and American forces. On the sea, China maintains a significant force with 1 test aircraft carrier not rated for combat operations, 50 light frigates, 29 destroyers, 39 corvettes, and 73 submarines. While large,
just look at that. Everything is filled here. That is crazy.
Larger in number than Indian naval forces, China lacks the ability to maintain long-term logistical support for any deployed ships, meaning only a small number of them could operate far from China's shores for longer than a few weeks. Underpinning China's military might is also the fact that its military is severely affected by systemic corruption, so much so that China's own leadership doubts the ability of the Chinese military to fight and win a major war against a near-peer power such as India. On to Russia. Russia has the world's 2nd most
Russia is a big one as well.
Most powerful military, with an active duty force of just over 1 million personnel and a reserve force of
Look at that reserve force, man.
2.5 million. With 818 fighter aircraft and 1,416 attack aircraft, Russia's air forces are formidable, but would be severely hampered in war by a lack of reconnaissance assets. As one Russian military analyst put it, we have long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapons, but we don't always know where the target is. On the ground, though, Russia maintains the world's largest tank fleet, numbering over 20,000.
20,000 tanks, bro.
However, this figure should be taken with a grain of salt, as the number includes many thousands of Soviet-era tanks that have long been decommissioned and would need weeks to bring into service, and even once operational, would be decades behind in capability, firepower, and protection versus modern tanks. Russia's naval fleet has severely atrophied since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it still maintains 1 aircraft carrier, 9 frigates, 13 destroyers, 78 corvettes, and 62 submarines. Though Russian vessels are on the whole aging and plagued by maintenance issues, they are still armed with very modern and capable long-range missiles, making them a force to be feared. And finally, the world's chief military power, the United States of America. The US and
Let's see what we got here.
There's the conflict on India's side, with an active duty force of 1.3 million personnel and 800,000 reserve personnel. With 1,962 fighter aircraft and 2,830 multi-role aircraft, the US has almost double the air power of Russia or China. Its naval aviation
Look at that air power, bro.
forces alone are on par with either nation. Its fleet of 973 attack helicopters ensure that ground offensives are well covered, and it is rare that an American infantryman finds himself without fire support. A proponent of blitzkrieg warfare, America also maintains a fleet of 5,900 tanks, almost all of them modern Abrams variants, and 39,000 armored fighting vehicles, giving its ground forces unparalleled mobility. While lagging behind in numbers, America's 950 self-propelled, 795 towed, and 1,200 rocket artillery platforms often feature smart, precision-guided munitions. In fact, of all the militaries in the world, the United States uses the most precision-guided munitions, featuring them on almost every combat platform and giving US forces incredible lethality. At the onset of war, Chinese and Indian border forces stationed across the length of the Himalayas would come into immediate conflict. While initial predisposition of forces favors the Indian army, the narrow roads and valleys of the mighty Himalayas would make anything but meager gains all but impossible. Artillery would devastate any sizable forces trying to move through mountain gaps, leaving most of the combat action to light infantry units supported by helicopters. With Chinese forces primarily stationed along its eastern coast, India would initially have the upper hand both in the air and on the ground. Only a few air bases on the Tibetan Plateau could support combat operations for the Chinese, while dozens of airfields on India's side could put all Indian planes within combat range of the front lines. It would take weeks for China to construct makeshift airfields and air bases, and then rebase the bulk of its air fleet to the Tibetan Plateau, during which time, despite more advanced Chinese aircraft, Indian forces would enjoy a degree of air superiority. Yet the mountainous terrain would make it difficult for India to exploit that air superiority, and it would be forced to try to use ground attack planes when it would be far more efficient to use attack helicopters, of which India, again, only has 15. Once China relocated its mobile ballistic missile launchers to its western military regions, however, India would face a withering barrage of ballistic missiles that it could do absolutely nothing to protect itself from. Airfields and military command and control nodes across northern and eastern India would be devastated, and India's Air Force would suddenly find it very difficult to maintain hard-won air superiority, giving China the time needed to rebase its own air forces. Yet this is where China would have to make a very difficult choice. If it moves its forces to counter the Indian threat, it will leave the Pacific front completely vulnerable to American attack. Caught between the literal rock of the Himalayas, swarming with Indian infantry, and the hard choice of leaving itself vulnerable to coastal raids by the American Navy, China may look to its Russian allies for a solution. Russia would need to carefully consider the strategic situation. Its Chinese allies desperately depend on the Pacific Ocean for trade, importing most of their oil via sea trade routes and with domestic reserves not yet ready to support long-term war. With the majority of China's trade and oil passing through the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy is, as one analyst put it, poised on China's jugular and could easily cripple China with a naval blockade of Chinese shipping. America's Pacific forces are, on their own, also more than sufficient to cripple the Chinese economy with a trade blockade, and China's Navy could not hope to counter America on its own.
Oh, that's quite interesting, actually. It's crazy how they actually planned everything out.
Desperately needing to ensure the oil lifeline stays open for its ally, Russia would likely try to bolster its Pacific fleet with large elements of its northern fleet. Yet, depending on the time of year, the Arctic ice may not have melted enough to open up shipping lanes. Either way, whatever naval forces Russia could muster on the Pacific would be needed to aid the Chinese in fending off the American Navy. This would still not be enough to save the Chinese economy, however, as India's navy would never have to leave home to stop all Chinese shipping in the Indian Ocean. With a very limited capability to support its own navy far from its shores, China could at best scrounge together a small battle group of destroyers and cruisers with perhaps a few nuclear submarines to try and break the Indian blockade. Yet with India operating so close to home shores, it could take advantage of shore-based air power and make quick work of any Chinese task force. In the end, China could not hope to stand against naval blockades by both the US and India, even with reinforcements from the Russian Navy. This is China's glaring Achilles heel, its almost complete reliance on the sea for trade and oil, and why China has been ambitiously undergoing its modern Silk Road infrastructure development program with friendly nations, with very mixed success. Caught between the threat of raids on its Pacific coast by the US Navy and Indian forces pushing through the Himalayas, China would likely choose not to deploy its ballistic missiles to the west, as even if India managed to break out of the Himalayas, China's western territory is largely of little economic value. It would be far more prudent for China to try to keep America's carrier groups at bay with its DF-21 ballistic missiles, though China has still, to date, failed to show it has the capability to follow through on the threat of its ballistic missile forces by displaying a mastery of the various tracking, recon, and targeting systems and assets needed to go from launch to successful kill, or the ability to properly defend them from US attack. At best, the Sino-Russian alliance could hope to hold India at bay in the Himalayas and could likely even push India back once Chinese and Russian personnel created enough forward air bases on the Tibetan Plateau to support offensive operations. Yet Chinese and Russian forces would be limited to advancing only as far as the Indian foothills on the western edges of the Himalayas. The narrow passes and undeveloped roads through those passes would not make it possible to transport large amounts of hardware into India itself, while India could hold vast amounts of tanks and artillery on its plains ready to crush any advance into Indian territory. In short, it would be guaranteed suicide to try to break out of the Himalayas for both the Chinese and Russian forces. Meanwhile, India and the US could starve China into submission by devastating its economy through naval blockades. It would take weeks for the US to degrade Russia's and China's naval and air forces enough to attempt an amphibious assault against either nation, but the high casualties would make it a very unappealing proposition. Instead, the US could comfortably sit back and bottle the Russian fleet up while systematically destroying the Chinese fleet, leaving their Indian allies to continue denying China's desperately needed oil imports. A US-India and Russia-China war would end with very little territory gained or lost on either side, and with staggering amounts of casualties for Indian and Chinese forces. The US Navy would likely see significant casualties, but both Russia's and China's navies would be all but completely destroyed. China and India's economies would be devastated, but China's specifically could face a catastrophic collapse that could even lead to the end of its Communist Party's rule. With so much to lose and practically nothing to gain, neither side would ever seriously consider such a war, but if they did...
Yeah, wow. Because these are the top 4 biggest countries for military power, in my opinion. So if anything happens between these countries, bro, it's going to be nasty.
China's inability to protect its sea trade routes would make one side the clear victor. If you want to be able to make videos like this one, but even better looking, we suggest taking an intro class into 3D animation.
Wow, that was an interesting video actually. Let me know guys your thoughts in the comments below about this, what you have in mind about these two countries going to war and so on and so forth, you know. Hope you will enjoy this video. If you do like this sort of content, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be seeing you on the next video. Peace out.